Well, thank you, Divya. Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming here. And of course, it's always a pleasure to be in this school, and also a bit intimidating because I haven't lectured now for 15 years. So it'll take me some time to warm up, I suppose. Divya just mentioned, I've written this unreadable book called The Invention of Society. And it's unreadable because I wrote it in a few months, but revising it took longer because every time I revised it, I had to fall asleep. So you can imagine how riveting it will be for most of you. So at any rate, there was something that was knocking on the door, and I had to get it over with. For a long time, I resisted the idea of writing the book, but the idea grew within me, and eventually I got it done. And I'm going to field the findings to you today, or the arguments to you today, and I hope they work with you. I've always found that the JNU crowd is the most difficult to please, and I enjoyed that very much when I invited other people. I could see them squirm. It's not a good idea to face the same audience myself. However, most of you are students of sociology, I assume, or at least social sciences. And in my view, there's a lot of give and take between different social sciences, to the extent that very often in JNU, I think, the advantage we had is that we had friends from across disciplines, in the social sciences at least, which includes, by the way, international studies. And I think to a large measure, we were much more fortunate than other universities in the country. Let's say the one in Delhi University was next door, because those departments are kind of hermetically sealed, whereas we have this constant cross-fertilization between departments, which is, I think, a great advantage. And in my student days, when I was your age, you must believe I was your age once. When I was your age, I benefited a great deal from it. Of course, sociology is fine, and we had very good teachers, but being able to interact with others who questioned you, put you under the microscope, really. And as a consequence, you learned a lot, even as you felt uncomfortable. So I hope this is the same experience for you as well. I'm sure it is. Which is why when I wrote this piece called The Invention of Society, I was also thinking of other disciplines. Of course, sociology was foremost in my mind. There's no doubt about that. But I think what I'm going to say to you today would probably apply to other disciplines as well, though I've not worked that aspect out fully. I leave it to you or to others if you're interested, but that's the way it is. The reason I thought of this subject is because, we've been through tremendous changes and upheavals in our country, not our country alone, across the world. Great changes have happened, not just technological changes, of which we, are quite proud as a humanity, but also changes in terms of social arrangements. Things that we are doing today in terms of relationship between people could not have been imagined earlier. Just 100 years ago, it was not kosher to have a woman elected to parliament. It wasn't right till about a few decades back to think in terms of anti-untouchability or to give rights to gays. That these ideas just were not just anathema, they were hostile to these ideas. And today we see them as par for the course. No one gets really worked up on any of these. In fact, because of these institutions, today our democracy is richer, our society is richer. So what was at one time unthinkable is so thinkable and everyday now. It's like any old fat sandwich. Nothing extraordinary is there. And that is what makes me think that there is something missing perhaps. I'm using the word perhaps advisedly. Something missing perhaps in our acknowledged understanding of sociological theory. And what is missing, I think, is that we've advanced a great deal, there's no doubt about it. But one aspect is missing, and that is we don't have in sociological theory a good way of accepting changes in the system without thinking in terms of anomie or disorder or breakdown. So if you look at any of the famous sociologists, many of whom I've even taught in class here with great pleasure, I can't say that for the students, but for example, Talcott Parsons, Habermas, and a whole range of scholars in between the two of them, the most important that they say again and again is a kind of value consensus. This is a normative, understanding in society, and we obey that normative understanding on account of which we're able to function, right? And this normative consensus, if violated, brings about anomie or disruption. Now, of course, Parsons wrote about it very elegantly, and I'm a great admirer of Parsons, but these ideas were perhaps best expressed by Durkheim before him. Parsons elaborated it to a large extent, and he brought in several other issues, especially in terms of the action frame of reference, which was not clear in the other renditions, and Parsons made that very clear. And when you come to Habermas, it's a different version, but again, life world is a life world of consensus, in the sense that all of us function in a world which we understand so thoroughly, is so ingrained in us, that it remains untheorized. I don't have to explain to you. You and I know about it. It is just a basic common denominator. There's no point in telling you why it is so. And this life world, or in other words, a Weltanschauung, or the normative consensus that we have arrived at, actually tell us a lot about society and the reason why we're able to function as well as we do. There's, however, one hitch which occurs to me, especially in my study of modernity. When I look at modernity, I mentioned these points to you earlier, these issues come up. There have been great changes in society, and the society hasn't broken down. The society has in turn prospered. You would have imagined that if untouchability were to be outlawed, if, for example, the Hindu Marriage Act were to be made a law as it was, or the women were getting the right to vote, or the property is no longer a criterion to get voting rights. All of these are major seismic changes, earthquakes actually. And yet today we take them as normal. And what is more, the society hasn't broken down. In fact, the society has prospered on account of that. Now, my question is a very simple one, in which case, how does one accommodate all of this within the framework that, let's say, Parsons talked about, the normative framework? Where does that fit in then? Or the Weltanschauung or Habermas's life world, where does that fit in? Because these are new things, and according to them, it should have brought about a great degree of unrest and disturbance. It did not. It did, yes, temporarily, but over a period of time, all that smoothened out, and in fact, we were healthier than what we were ever before. So this is one kind of illness that leaves you much stronger than what you were before you fell ill, which is, I think, a very positive sign. So this is the basic question that I wanted to address. Why is it that these stresses don't lead to social breakdown? Why, on the other hand, you have a firming up of the basic elements of society even stronger than they were before? The big difference, I think, is that in the past, right down to Habermas, or even later perhaps, let's say those who are ethicists who talk about ethics, Emmanuel Levinas, you may have heard of him. Now, all these people, by the way, they all talk about this consensus in society that has been arrived at. And some of them, of course, doff their hat and say, yes, it is because of democracy that we've come this far. Perfectly all right. I'm completely in agreement. But what I want to ask is, what happens when democracy itself institutes changes which you never anticipated before? Why hasn't that broken down the society, and why has society in turn come out stronger and better equipped, perhaps more muscular than before? How is that the case? So this was the question that I began with. And then I thought to myself, one of the major reasons is that we in social theory, when you talk about normative consensus or Weltanschauung or whatever, we're constantly emphasizing what can be done. What can be done is the basic area of interest. You can do this, you can do that, you can't do this. If you do something else, it's a breakdown. Merton, for example, said very clearly, if that is not upheld, then society goes into disorder. So now, as I told you with the examples I gave you, why hasn't society gone into disorder? It has in turn done better. So my insertion in all of this is this, that we have been barking up the wrong tree by emphasizing what can be done or what should be done. But what is most important is for democracy and for society is to be very, very clear about what cannot be done. Once we pay attention to what cannot be done, all of these things fall into place. If you know what cannot be done, why is that so? Because when you know what cannot be done, then the whole world is open in terms of what can be done. Just ask yourself, these are the things I cannot do. But what can I do? Anything else. The whole world is open. If you abide by the tenets of what cannot be done, there is no stopping you in terms of invention, innovation, thinking afresh, thinking anew, without the system breaking down. The system will now break down when you violate the rules of what cannot be done. Now, the inspiration for this came from various sources to me, but the early inspiration, I think, came many, many years ago, which I kind of neglected, I should say, when I was studying the problems of Punjab, the Sikh problem in Punjab during the bad days of Punjab in the late 80s. And then it occurred to me that the reason why you can't talk to the other in a situation like in Punjab or wherever there's militancy, etc., and there's a breakdown of communication, it usually happens when, is it all right? It usually happens when the two sides have nothing in between to mediate. If you and I, let us say, are talking to each other and we don't have language, grammar as the third side to mediate our conversation, then you and I will be speaking to each other meaninglessly. You won't understand what I'm saying, I won't understand what you're saying. So when Jacques Lacan long back wrote in Écrit that when there is no third party, the triad is not there, then communication ends up with not sentences, not words, but with a cry. Let's say in the Punjab, the cry of the militants. Because I'm not understanding them. Neither side understands them because they feel that the state has lost its triadic position to mediate, like grammar. So it's like this. In grammar, and this is a very old story, say Noam Chomsky made it more lively. In grammar, you and I can speak to each other because there is grammar, so we understand each other, right? But more importantly, and this is really the rub, the more important point is I can now articulate a sentence which has never been spoken of before. You want to see an example of that? There's a man called Surinder Jyotka who's sitting to my left. He's crossed his legs and is looking at the camera. Nobody has said this sentence before in the world, ever. You're lucky. But this sentence, nobody has spoken of before, but all of you understand the sentence, isn't it? Because there is grammar. So I am able to articulate new sentences, though that sentence has never been said before. Now, this does not fit very well with Parsons' value consensus, because here you have a completely new sentence, which is completely comprehensible and yet never been spoken before. Why? Because you and I, our communication is governed by a third, that is the triad. So dyadic communications are not good enough. And if dyadic communications alone were to exist, then you wouldn't have had a society like we have today. A similar thing you can now see also in the realm of sport. I think sport is a very good example of modernity and democracy for various reasons. One is the historical reason. We didn't have sport for many, many centuries. Forever, we didn't have sport. We had games. Games were played. And what is the difference between games and sport? Just the same as the difference between a language which has a triad and a language which has no triad. In a game, there's no rules. You and I are playing, and then we get tired, we stop playing. Or I'm playing in your house and you are the nobleman, so I have to lose in this game with you. Games, rules are made up as you go. Did you know that till the late 1880s, in the football games in Shroff football or the football league in England, there were no referees. Referees came up afterwards. Why? The referee became the triad. The referee was the third node. So two teams are playing and the referee is there, and therefore the two teams are playing according to the rules of sport. So sport came into existence when rules were framed in a fashion that was independent of dyad and governed the dyad. So the rules of sport and the rules of society are very similar in some ways. You cannot play sport when there's no referee, there are no rules. You can play games, however, but you can't play sport. I think the institution of sport is so interesting because it is around the same time as democracy was beginning to show itself in the world. Before that, there was no sport. As democracy grew in the Western world, so did sport grow. The rules of sport and the rules of democracy almost grew in parallel. And this is simply because I think that the basic engine is similar. In both cases, you needed a triadic formulation to make it work, without which you cannot play sport, you can play games, without which you cannot communicate, but you can cry, and you can make a lot of noise, but communication is not possible. Now, I think that earlier sociologists, to take a shorthand term for scholars, didn't quite think in terms of what cannot be done, emphasize instead what can be done. Even there, it's really interesting that till the time in the West, till the time of, say, Kant, Immanuel Kant, very rarely did you have anybody who even acknowledged the other in their philosophies. It was all about the self. Even Kant, for that matter, Critique of Pure Reason. The Critique of Pure Reason is about the self. What do I see? What do I perceive? What are the categories of knowledge? That's what he was talking about. There was no other in the picture. The other came up much later in Kant in the Metaphysics of Morals. The other came up later even in Hegel. You see, the first Hegel talked about the master-slave relationship, which is such a backward way of looking at things. Master-slave, that's everything. And master-slave relationship was, in my view, the worst possible book Hegel has ever written, and is quoted by everybody. I don't know why. But Hegel, in The Philosophy of Right, moves away from that and talks about the other. Now, in social sciences, whether it is Kant, after Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, from the time he wrote Metaphysics of Morals, from then on, in Metaphysics of Morals, he also talked about, things that are good manners, bad manners, what ought to be, that kind of stuff. Very loosely formulated, but at least there was a recognition that there are other people around in the world. It's not just about myself. In all traditional philosophies, in all traditional religions, including our own, the emphasis has always been on the self. How can I improve myself? How can I cleanse myself? How can I be in touch with God? The other comes very rarely. I've looked at Hindu scriptures from the Vedas to the Upanishads, and I found that only in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is the other mentioned, along in the Esha Upanishad. But in passing, not as a deep concern, that comes very much later. In my view, it comes very much later in European philosophy, and over time it comes to India as well. Now, the reason I mention this to you is because very often we are struck with this angst that we in India don't pay attention to our theoretical heritage. We forget about the past, all the contributions made by people. Well, it's important to know all that, but I don't think it's important for sociology. You want to be a historian of ideas? Go ahead. You want to be a theologian? Go ahead. You want to be a specialist in religion? Fine. But if you want to be a sociologist, you gain nothing by looking at scholars who predate the beginning of society. You don't get much at all. In fact, if you look at political science, Jean Baudin, Ideas of Sovereignty, or John Russell, Austin, they have no use today. None at all. It's still part of political science course. But what use is it? Nothing at all. To say then, when we are not paying attention to a heritage, nobody should pay attention to the heritage if you're a sociologist. You begin when society begins. That is the beginning of your knowledge. So I would say in India, for example, when society begins with democracy or whatever, the prehistory of that is probably Raja Ram Mohan Roy to Tagore to even Lajpat Rai. Lajpat Rai's contributions are very important, and we have not paid any significant attention to those aspects. So sociology has a very shallow history. It began very recently. And this shallow history is to our advantage. Because society began recently. Society began with democracy. Society began with the triad. Therefore, unlike other disciplines like science, like gravity, let's say, like medicine, which have a prehistory, and in the practitioners of these fields faced a lot of persecution. You've heard about that, isn't it? You've heard about Galileo's persecution. You've heard of those who talked about, they were burned to the stake, some of them. It was that bad. But social scientists haven't faced that persecution because social science began when civilization, in a manner of speaking, began. So you don't have persecution of that kind in the social sciences. So it is just as well that in social science we don't have a history, a shallow history, because that shallow history is to our advantage. It's not to our disadvantage. And I think some of us are so enamored by the idea of tradition and genealogy, we want to go back in time and find who our forefathers were in thought. But in my view, those forefathers are not of much use at all. I've been to some of these forefathers, I've chatted with them, I find them very boring and unnecessary. For example, if you read Thomas Aquinas, what good is it for you? I don't see. I mean, if someone could tell me about it, it's good in terms of, well, it's a curious item, so it's fine. You say it's all right. I didn't know this. Did it really happen? Well, it did. Well, this man said so. So all right, you move on. But if you're really thinking of social sciences, I would say the beginning in Western philosophy would perhaps be Kant, definitely Hegel, and after that. It's interesting that after Hegel wrote the philosophy of right, after that, probably every social scientist, every philosopher, social thinker, not philosopher, I'm a little allergic to philosophers, every social scientist has talked about self and other. Till the late 18th century, it was a self, right? And suddenly from the 19th century onwards, it's always self-other. Whether it is Hegel, or it is Marx, or it is Engels, or it's anybody you can think of, Weber, it was always self and other. So it wasn't just authority. It was not just power, it was authority because there was the other involved. It was just not money, like in businessmen have a bundle of money under the pillows, but it was capital. Why was it capital? Because capital meant a relationship between capital and labor. There was self and other. So from the time of Hegel onwards, every thinker, sociologist has spoken in terms of self and other. What they have not talked about is the triad. Self and other is a great improvement, I think. It's a fantastic improvement from the past, which is why I say in the past we didn't even acknowledge the other. And therefore I don't see any point in studying that stuff. But since the time we started acknowledging the other, it was a short step away to accepting the triad. But surprisingly, in my view, because nobody really, emphasizes enough. Even little issues like, shall we say, what is secularism? Secularism, most of us think, is when the church was undermined by the state. But if you read Karl Mannheim, I think he was very good in this direction. He said, it is not enough. You will not get secularism only because the state has been undermined by the church has been undermined by the state. The state can also be dictatorial. Because what is most important in secularism is, I should be able to ask the question, prove it to me. That question I should be able to ask. If the state is in complete control, I can't ask the state, prove it to me. Just like I cannot ask religion or theologians or the theocracy, prove it to me, right? I can't even ask the state. The state says, well, I say so, therefore it is true. You have heard that wonderful phrase, isn't it? After me the floods, the deluge. So if the king says so, that is it. You can't question it. So what was Mannheim's argument? Mannheim's argument was that you are really secular only when you can ask the question, prove it to me from everybody else. And that invokes the third party. You have to prove it to me. If I can be shown this, and not be put in jail, then that shows that this is secularism. You had, as I told you earlier, Arthur Koestler wrote a book called The Sleepwalkers. Some of you may have read it. The Sleepwalkers. The Sleepwalkers, Arthur Koestler details, I think with a lot of information, what the astronomers that we know of, famous astronomers, Kepler or whatever, Tycho Brahe particularly, that they disguise their knowledge in terms of astrology to be able to function. Because if they talked about astronomy, bang, off with their head. So they said, we are astrologers. And every now and then they told the king some hocus pocus about, this is a good day for you to conduct a war, that's a good day for you to conduct peace. And they believed them. But actually, they were all interested in astronomy, not astrology. But they did astrology. In fact, Saint Simon wrote about it also. He said the Berthollet and other people had to disguise themselves as astrologers, as soothsayers even, but not as astronomers, because that would invite the wrath of the authorities. So there's no secularism really, there's no religion, but the state is as bad perhaps, in controlling knowledge. So secularism for him, for Mannheim, which I agree with, is when you can ask this question. And only when you can ask this question can it be worthwhile. Think of it. In medicine, there was a man called Anthony von Leeuwenhoek. Many of you probably haven't heard of him, which is a pity because Leeuwenhoek was a draper. He wasn't a scientist. He was a draper, but he was crazy about microscopes. And ever since the microscope was invented, Alan Macfarlane is a very well-known anthropologist, a Cambridge anthropologist. He wrote a book called The Glass Bathyscaphe. The Glass Bathyscaphe is a very interesting book. We know the Iron Revolution, don't we? And the changes Iron Revolution brought. But Alan Macfarlane points out to us that you are ignoring one thing, which is the glass revolution. Because of glass, the telescope came, the microscope came. If we didn't have the telescope or microscope, modern science would not happen. And we don't talk about the invention of glass. Like I'm talking about the invention of society, Alan Macfarlane talked about the glass revolution. So when you have glass, people like Anthony von Leeuwenhoek, forget about Galileo, they of course used telescopes, but Anthony von Leeuwenhoek, a draper, sells cloth, and he is in England, in Holland, lots of water bodies there, and he's interested in what slithers under the water. So he should take little samples, put them under the microscope, and he saw little creatures wriggling around. He called them animalcules. They were actually early forms of bacteria he was noticing, but he didn't know it was bacteria. Because had he said it was bacteria, something else, the state and the church would have killed him. So it was his animalcules and left at that. Now retrospectively we say Anthony von Leeuwenhoek was the early inventor. He didn't know he was an inventor. We're making it up actually. He had no idea. He just saw those little things and he wrote about it. So the idea of secularism depends a lot on this triad, without which you cannot have secularism either. So this is one of the reasons why science, not, as I told you, not just human arrangement of women getting the right to vote, marginals getting the right to vote, gays being respected and their rights are being respected, not just human arrangement, even the physical sciences have advanced because of the triadic formulation, such as without secularism, these things couldn't have ever happened. Now, let me give you two quotations. One is from Baba Sahib Ambedkar. Now, please don't say not again. Everybody quotes Ambedkar these days. But I'm quoting Ambedkar because there are certain aspects of Ambedkar, and I'll be very honest with you, it's not all of Ambedkar, but certain aspects of Ambedkar which are absolutely brilliant. And those aspects have to do with democracy, with constitution, and I think is perhaps unmatched worldwide in terms of his theoretical contribution. So he said once, very succinctly, that democracy is not just a political organization. Now everyone says democracy is a political organization. So he says democracy is not just a political organization. It's a human arrangement, primarily, of conjoint experiences which are communicated. So that is what democracy is. It is not just politics. It is about the way we live. That is what democracy is. And very often we forget that aspect. We think it's just politics, and therefore we think you put the vote in and you're done. But democracy is much more than that. In fact, if I were to go by Ambedkar, then democracy is one of the hardest things ever to practice. It is the most difficult and contrived social arrangement ever. What is easy? Monarchy is easy. Casteism is easy. Theocracy is easy. Slavery is easy. But democracy, my God, that's a tough one. Why? Because in democracy, you have to accept the triad. That's why democracy is so difficult. And therefore, the definition given by, this one definition of society, I hope you appreciate what I'm saying. The other is by T.H. Marshall. T.H. Marshall was a political thinker, I won't say scientist, political thinker in the London School of Economics. He didn't write much, but he wrote this one book which really was marvelous. In that book, he defined citizenship, amongst other things. But his definition of citizenship is very important. So he says citizenship is the, what is it? Is the establishment of equality, endowment of equality on everybody, right? But the tricky, this is very known to everybody, you know, citizenship is equality. But it has another line to it. Just like Ambedkar had, you know, that you have constant communication. The other line is, on this equality, structures of inequality may be built. So once you establish equality, then go ahead and be as different as you want to. But everybody should have access to that equality. And then he goes on to say, what is it that makes you equal? Fundamentally, he says, what makes you equal is equality of education, equality of health, and availability of resources of energy. Now, if you get all of these, right, then it's up to you to decide what you want to do. So it is not as if citizenship means everybody is equal. Now, this kind of hardline equality is not what he's talking about. In fact, even Montesquieu, I'll come to Montesquieu in a while, even he was upset against those radicals in his time who talked about equality all the time. But here what Huxley did, what Marshall did, was to give it a twist which is so simple, so elementary, and yet it had tremendous consequences. And what was it? Upon which structures of inequality may be built. So you begin with baseline equality and then go ahead and be as different as you want to. You want to waste your time, waste it. It's your business. You want to be a scientist, go ahead. You want to be a sportsman, fine. But that basic equality has to be given, and that is what citizenship is about. It is not about equality of ends, it's equality of means. That you have that, and then you can do what you want to do. And you can be very, very different. The reason I gave the example of sport was, now just imagine Sachin Tendulkar hits a boundary, you know, a cover drive which is just exquisite. Nobody, let's imagine, and I think it's quite true, that kind of cover drive was probably never executed before. Or like the sentence I told you about. Or you've heard of Michael Jordan? Michael Jordan jumps 4 feet, and for a nanosecond he defies the laws of gravity, stands still, and goes another few inches, right? The referee does not blow the whistle because he's done something innovative, but he hasn't broken the rule of what cannot be done. That rule is still intact, but has done something innovative. Muhammad Ali, the boxer, now when he was in his prime, poor man had a very terrible end. In his prime, Muhammad Ali used to sway like a cobra. So a tactic which his trainer, Angelo Dundee, despaired. He said, this is not the way to do it, you must cover up. But he used to sway, and in swaying, the other chap would expend all his energy. And he would sway, you know, spontaneously. Later, Angelo Dundee, his trainer, said, well, if this is his natural talent, I'm not going to stop it. I'll let him go ahead. So what was supposed to be the wrong thing to do turned out to be the right thing to do as far as Ali was concerned, so long as he didn't break the rules of what cannot be done. So I think this is, in my view, a very central feature. And what cannot be done is not between you and me. Somebody else, it should be some other body, another node, which governs this relationship. And this node is the democratic society. Because the rules of what cannot be done are universal rules. It's not rules between you and me. We haven't made it up over tea. It's a rule that's universal and binding on everybody. In other words, it's a rule that binds all citizens. So because it's a rule that binds all citizens, this rule can only happen in a democracy. Nowhere else can it happen. Why is that so? Because in democracy, there is citizenship whose fundamental axiom is that we begin as equals. That's a fundamental axiom. If that's the fundamental axiom, then that impregnates everything. Do you see what I mean? And that impregnates everything, and therefore you are forced to accept the fact that you and I can communicate, you and I can interact only when there's a third party. So, though Hegel and others brought in the dyad, Marx was a great promoter of the dyad. In fact, in Marx's Manifesto of the Communist Party, you find a breakdown of the triad. He doesn't mention the triad at all. In the manifesto, he says, well, the triad is not there. He didn't say use the word triad. The state is not there. The state is the managing agency of the business people. So there's no such state. So it's really a fight between capital and labor. No holds barred. You kill or get killed. Isn't that so? The basic theorem in manifesto. And this theorem in manifesto was later contradicted by whom? None other than Engels. When Engels wrote the preface to Class War in Germany, or Peasant War in Germany, or Class Struggle in France, in that preface he wrote that what we had said earlier is not applicable anymore. It doesn't work anymore. And we have to revive our thinking of revolution, which many people in our country and other places also have not done. But he said we have to revise our thinking of education, of revolution. Marx began that revision in Capital Volume 1, where he talked about real and formal subsumption of labor in the appendix, and what is more important is a question of what is socially necessary labor. Now, you may remember that earlier that aspect was not there. Capital exploits labor, labor becomes poorer and poorer, the capitalists get richer and richer, rich capitalist, poor worker. It's an animal theory of revolution, right? And I, in desperation, I cannot get food to eat, I revolt. No, but when it comes to socially necessary labor, it's very different. In socially necessary labor, labor techniques keep improving. And so what was socially necessary labor at point T is not socially necessary labor at point T2. Because in the meantime, labor has improved, quality of labor has improved, quality of skills have improved. And so things are changing. And that is a big difference between the early and the later Marx. I'm not talking about the Althusserian version. I'm talking of this version where you have a rethink on the relationship between capital and labor, which I think is very, very critical. It changes all of our perceived notion of what Marx was, and Engels at the same time, and what it means to think in terms of interaction. So earlier, Marx and Engels were also, I think, rather dyadic in nature. Their thinking is capital versus labor, nothing else. One kills the other. That's it. That's all. And that is why much later, Jacques Lacan said, the man I quoted to you earlier, Lacan is L-A-C-A-N. Jacques Lacan said that when there's no third party, I have to consume the other. You know? So the importance is that both sides want to consume the other, which comes out very clearly in Hegel's master-slave relationship. You have to consume the other. You can't have a relationship. It's consumption. You have to completely dominate the other. So my emphasis right through will be, how can I subjugate, humiliate, trample upon the other person? That is my only aim in life, because there's no triad at work. So once you bring in the triad, you realize that the dyad is not enough. Of course, the earlier things we can just dismiss because they were really, really backward. But ever since dyad came into being, even that is not enough unless you have the triad in work, in operation, because the dyad can be self-destructive. Or, shall I put it this differently, they can be mutually destructive. One will destroy the other over time. Now, because you have the dyad and because triad and because you have citizenship, therefore look at the way in which social sciences have developed. Social science has developed only on the basis of democracy. Prior to democracy, we didn't ask this question. Today we ask the question, let's say in sociology, the question we ask is, why is there inequality? Nobody asked this question earlier. Inequality, of course, is God-given or it is monarch-given. Inequality is inequality. It's because I'm much better than you are. I'm blessed more than you are, and I have the right, I'm a sovereign authority, divine right. So inequality was not a question that had to be asked. It was never really a serious problem. Today, inequality is a very important problem, not just in terms of documenting inequality. Most of social science, I can easily say most of social science, is based on understanding why is there inequality, what should we do about it, and how can we lessen the impact of inequality so that, look at this, so that, it's not clearly mentioned always, but it's always there, sotto voce, knocking on your brain, so that we can achieve a better society. We're not just interested in doing something which is curious or different. We're doing it with a purpose in mind. So when you go and do a village study, for example, it's not simply because you want to do a village study. In fact, these old-fashioned village studies are quite useless today. Village study is important because you're asking these questions. Why is there inequality? What is happening? How are we getting over it? Can we get over it? Can we have a different kind of social order? That's what they're asking today. In history, we're asking a similar question. We're not asking questions like, what did Akbar do? Or what did so-and-so do? That's not important. We want to ask that question keeping in mind the problems of today, which is why Benedetto Croce, you heard of Croce, C-R-O-C-E? Benedetto Croce said something very interesting. I mean, it's as good as the other two quotations. That is, history is the obsession with the present. That is, what obsesses you today, to understand that, you go to history. You just don't go to history. So, for example, if you look at the history of, say, Herodotus, or Abul Fazl, or Farsian, their history is very different from modern history. Totally. I mean, Herodotus, this is so irritating sometimes that in Western thinkers, they say our first historian was Herodotus. Herodotus didn't know history. In Herodotus, there's nothing at all. Colon went to Lydia, and then he met Croesus. And Croesus thought he was the happiest man on earth. And Colon said, no, you're not happy. The only happy person is a dead person. What's so great about this? But that's supposed to be a great, pivotal point in Western history. I think it's rubbish. Simply because people want to find a person of antiquity whom they can then claim and say we have a huge, long heritage. There's nothing historical about it. Or look at Abul Fazl. He spends a lot of time in his history of Akbar talking about the visions people had when Akbar was being born. Now, which historian today would do that? Or Farsian, talking about the desert spirits, the wild spirits in the deserts of India. And people look that down. But that's not history. We won't do that today. Today our history is very different. And I think the reason it's different is because we are obsessed with the present. We look at the present and then we say, how can we understand past in the light of the present so that the present can be modified? Any historian that's not interested in that is no historian at all. You do history because you're concerned with the present. You don't do history because you're only thinking of the past. That is no good. That is like a species of mythology. A true historian is concerned with the present all the time. So if you look at the questions that historians ask today, these questions are questions that could only come up with democracy. They couldn't have come up earlier. Not possible. That is the same thing with, let's say, economics or political science. They're all concerned about this one issue. And what is most interesting is that because we live in the present and because there's a triad and because we can make adjustments and inventions, in that process, we can make mistakes. Now you see, Talcott Parsons was the first one, I think, who introduced the notion of error in action frame of reference. And he stopped there. But he should have gone further. Error is not that I have made the wrong choice in terms of the alternatives available. Should I go to work by bus or by car or by bicycle? I can make an error. All three are acceptable. I can make an error. I chose the bus, but there was a traffic jam. I made an error. I chose a bicycle. There was a tire puncture. There was an error. Many years ago, I had a car, which was probably fourth hand or fifth hand. It was a historical car. And it gave all kinds of trouble. One day, the right wheel came off in front of Krishi Bhavan, and I had to tow it back and fix it. And I was a warden of Brahmaputra Hostel those days. I was driving up to our university, our school, and in the bus stand, a student of mine was waiting. And I asked my student, "Do you want a lift?" He said, "No, sir, I'm in a hurry." So he didn't want to make a mistake. So you see, but these are options that are available. Now think of the fact that today we have work from home. This option was unthinkable. Now we have work from home options, so no bus, no cycle, no car, work from home. If I said this 10 years ago, I would have been laughed out of court. But today it is legitimate, it can happen. In fact, I think over 60% of the work today happens work from home. Now these are the new things that are coming up, which we have not paid attention to in the past. And this is what makes it so interesting to accept the triadic formulation so that we're not caught in the web of value consensus. Now, how did all of this begin? I told you sociology has a very shallow history. Okay? I'm sorry, I'm blasting away. You rarely get a captive audience. So anyway, I talked about the triad. I mentioned to you Jacques Lacan and so forth. But when you do sociology, very often they mention certain names. They're the three French triumvirate: Montesquieu, Saint-Simon, and Comte. From time to time, people also sneak in Locke, John Locke, into the mix. But I want to keep John Locke away because John Locke has often compromised in the sense that he has said that there are occasions when it is all right to have a monarch. There are occasions where it's all right to have slavery. No, it's not good to have slavery, but there are occasions where it's okay. So which is why I'm putting John Locke aside, because in my view, he's betrayed the side by making these concessions. But if you look at the three French, you'll find that they are very consistent in certain things. One is, none of them ever experienced society the way we're talking about it, because there was no democracy then. There was no democracy. And yet Montesquieu, Saint-Simon, Comte, they all talked about a democracy that's going to happen. So they say, even as, in fact, Comte, Saint-Simon used the phrase, when the right time comes. Montesquieu talked about a society again where there be separation of powers. And the separation of powers are picked up by James Madison in the American Revolution. Separation of powers, James Madison said, I got my idea from Montesquieu. Comte talks about the fact that you cannot have a legitimate rule where the poor are not considered as important. The monarchy can only be relevant if it considers the poor as number one task. This reminds me of John Rawls, who said in his Veil of Ignorance, have you read John Rawls? The Veil of Ignorance, the most important thing is, how does one take a decision which helps the poorest? Because the Veil of Ignorance, in that social contract or the imaginary relationship, you don't know who you are, you don't know who the other person is, therefore you would think that I don't know who I am until the veil is lifted, so naturally I will make policies that are good for the poorest, because I may be the poorest. Also, I don't know who I am, I may be the richest, so I must make a policy that will help the poorest and won't hurt the richest. So that was the way in which he looked at it. When I read Montesquieu, I found so much of that in Montesquieu. But of course, John Rawls hasn't quoted Montesquieu. Comte comes later, Saint-Simon before that. Saint-Simon was much more adamant. Montesquieu was it too. I think Montesquieu, of all of them, was much more theoretically refined. He said that we should have a society where no man need be afraid of another. They use the word man, but they meant human beings. No human should be afraid of another. This was his fundamental proposition. Now you have Saint-Simon coming in. Saint-Simon was much more vigorous and he talked about how bad the clergy was, how bad the monarchy was. In fact, he called the Pope a heretic. Can you imagine? He called the Pope a heretic. And he said we should do something about it. Now, contrary to Montesquieu, who impressed the Americans, what Saint-Simon did was he fought the American War of Revolution under Washington. He was there in the siege of Yorktown because he was so impressed by what was happening in America. He sailed all the way from France, and he was from a pretty well-to-do family. He sailed all the way to France, fought the American Revolution with bayonets and guns and whatever, and because he was so charged by it. And he brought that idea to France again, the American Revolution, which is a kind of a interesting thing because many, many years later, when the Bangladesh War happened, Andre Malraux did a similar thing. He strapped a gun and said, I'm going to fight for the Bangladeshis. Of course, he didn't go there, but he was willing to go there and fight for the Bangladeshis, somewhat like what Saint-Simon did. And later on came Comte. Now, Comte is the only one who actually saw the French Revolution. So you might say he saw the beginnings of society. And Engels, smart guy that he was, Engels said that Comte has seen the embryo of society. He used the word embryo. It's an embryonic form, which is interesting because Comte also is supposed to be not only the inventor of the term sociology, he's also inventor of the term altruism. Altruism is the invention of Comte. So these three thinkers who had not seen society, but were imagining it, dreaming it, which is why they were called utopians. They were called utopians not because their heads were in the cloud, but because they're looking at the future. That is why they were called utopians. And if one goes back to Karl Mannheim again, Karl Mannheim said, a good utopia is one that can be realized. That's the most important thing. There are utopias which are made in the clouds, right? But a good utopia is one which can be realized, and the one which these people are talking about was a good utopia which could be realized, and soon enough it was realized. Now, if you look at this good utopia, for example, I told you about errors, you'll find errors are so important in sociology and, in fact, in all of the social sciences. You cannot have political science without errors. I made an error this year. I voted for the wrong person. I'm going to correct it next year. I made an error in the Constitution. I'm going to amend it tomorrow. This is always the case, which is why, to be consistent in democracy is silly. You cannot be consistent. You have to be ready to change with the times, which is why Gandhi also said that I don't want to be called a hobgoblin of consistency. Consistency is not my strong point. Samuel Beckett, the famous Irish playwright, said, try again, fail again, but fail better. And this is what democracy allows you to do. You can fail, but you fail better, so long as you don't break the rules of what cannot be done. So in economics, you won't have economics at all if you couldn't make errors. You wouldn't have the stock market. You wouldn't have the whole question of enterprise. Enterprise is built on errors. Sociology, you wouldn't have had sociology because sociology is built on errors also. What kind of inequalities have come into the picture? How can we correct those inequalities? We made a mistake in correcting those inequalities. Now we are going to amend all of that. So sociology, political science, economics, the basic human sciences are built on the idea of errors. You take errors out of the picture, these sciences collapse. And these errors can only be accommodated in the rightful form, I would say in their legitimate and full-fledged form, only when you have a triadic node. If you don't have a triadic node, it's not there. So for me, a society is one where individuals arranged in hierarchy or arranged in categories interact with one another freely, only under one constraint, that is, they all know well what cannot be done. And this is my definition of society, and this is the argument I'm trying to push forward in my forthcoming book, which may be quite unreadable. Okay.